Hello and welcome to History Bedtime Stories. Close your eyes and let the sounds of the modern world fade into the distance. Imagine, if you will, a silence so profound it feels heavy, broken only by the rhythmic drip of condensation from a broad, emerald leaf and the distant, haunting call of a bird you cannot name. We are traveling back, far beyond the concrete and the noise, to a time when the map of the world was still a collection of vast, dark voids waiting to be filled by the dreams and despairs of men. We are entering the heart of South America in the early 16th century, a place where the air is thick with the scent of damp earth and the intoxicating promise of the impossible. But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. This is a simple way to support the channel. I am also always curious to know where in the world and at what time are you joining me tonight. So, I would really love to hear from you in the comments. The legend we seek tonight is not merely a story of gold, though gold is its heartbeat. It is a story of a whisper that grew into a roar, a ritual that transformed into a mirage, and a man who became a city. We call it El Dorado. But before it was a city of shimmering towers and paved streets of bullion, it was El Hombre Dorado, the Gilded One. To find the source of this whisper, we must climb. We must leave the steaming lowlands of the coast and ascend the jagged, mist-shrouded peaks of the Andes into the high-altitude cradle of the Muisca people. Picture the Altiplano Cundiboyacense, a vast, fertile plateau nestled nearly 8,000 feet above the sea in what we now call Colombia. Here, the air is thin and crisp, and the light has a crystalline quality that makes the green of the valleys seem to glow. The Muisca were not an empire in the way the Aztecs or Incas were. They were a sophisticated confederation of chiefdoms, masters of agriculture, weaving, and, most crucially, the art of the goldsmith. To the Muisca, gold was not currency. It held no economic value in the way the Europeans understood it. Instead, gold was the physical manifestation of the sun's energy, a sacred substance used to communicate with the divine. The whisper begins at the edge of a perfectly circular, emerald green lake called Guatavita. It sits in the crater of an extinct volcano, looking for all the world like a giant eye staring up at the heavens. Every time a new Zipa, or chieftain, was to take power, a ceremony occurred that would eventually set the world on fire. Imagine the shoreline crowded with thousands of people, their bodies painted with red and black pigments, the air vibrating with the sound of clay flutes and drums. At the center of the lake, a raft made of rushes drifted slowly through the morning mist. On this raft stood the new chieftain, but he was unrecognizable as a man. His body had been smeared with sticky resin and then covered from head to toe in fine gold dust until he shone like a living statue, a mirror for the rising sun. At his feet lay piles of worked gold, intricate tunjos or votive figures depicting warriors, mother goddesses, and animals, and heaps of deep green emeralds pulled from the earth of Muisca. As the raft reached the center of the lake, the Gilded One would dive into the freezing waters, washing away the gold as an offering to the goddess of the lake, while his attendants hurled the treasures into the depths. This was the factual core of the legend. It was a ritual of renewal, a sacred contract between a leader and his gods. But when the first Spanish conquistadors arrived on the coast, they did not hear a story of religious devotion. They heard the word gold. They heard of a king so wealthy he could afford to throw his treasure away. And in the fevered minds of men who had crossed an ocean for glory and wealth, the gilded man quickly evolved. If there was a king of gold, there must be a kingdom of gold. If there was a golden ritual, there must be a golden city. The first European to truly chase this whisper was Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada. In 1536, he led an expedition of 800 men into the interior of Colombia. It is difficult for us to grasp the sheer brutality of this journey. They were not walking through a park. They were hacking through vine-choked jungles where every step was a battle against malaria, yellow fever, and the constant threat of jaguars and venomous snakes. They wore heavy steel breastplates that turned into ovens under the tropical sun, their skin festering beneath the metal. Of the 800 men who started, only 166 survived to reach the Muisca Plateau. When Quesada finally stood upon the high plains, he found a civilization that stunned him. He saw well-ordered towns with houses of wood and thatch, decorated with plates of gold that tinkled in the wind like wind chimes made from the sun itself. He found elaborate irrigation systems that turned the high plateau into a garden, with fields of maize, potatoes, and quinoa stretching as far as the eye could see. The Muisca had developed a sophisticated calendar system based on their observations of the sun and moon, and their priests could predict eclipses with uncanny accuracy. But Quesada did not come as a guest or a student. The conquest of the Muisca was a systematic dismantling of their culture, executed with the ruthless efficiency of men who had learned their trade in the blood-soaked campaigns of the Mediterranean. The Spanish seized the gold they found, but it was never enough. They had expected to find another Cuzco, another Tenochtitlan, a city where the walls themselves were made of precious metal. Instead, they found a people who used gold for beauty and ceremony, not accumulation and display. The Spanish made their first attempt to drain Lake Guatavita almost immediately. Imagine the desperation. Hundreds of indigenous laborers forced to form a human chain, passing ceramic jars of water up the steep crater walls in a vain attempt to lower the lake's level. They managed to lower it by about 10 feet, revealing some gold trinkets along the muddy shoreline, but the depths remained untouched. The lake seemed to swallow their efforts, refilling itself faster than they could empty it, as if the goddess herself were laughing at their presumption. This failure did not discourage them. It only fueled the fire. If the gold wasn't easily reachable in the lake, they reasoned, then the real El Dorado must be deeper in the jungle, a city where the very walls were made of the precious metal. The Muisca, perhaps realizing that the Spanish obsession with gold was their only weakness, began to tell their captors what they wanted to hear. "The gold is not here," they would say, pointing toward the vast, unexplored basin of the Amazon. "It is there in the land of the Omagua in the city of Manoa." By 1539, 3 separate expeditions converged on the high plateau, led by 3 men from 3 different directions. Quesada from the north, Sebastián de Belalcázar from the south, and Nicolaus Federman from the east. They nearly went to war with one another over the right to claim this new kingdom of Granada. It was during these tense negotiations that the name El Dorado became firmly etched into the European lexicon. Belalcázar had heard the story of the gilded man from an indigenous captive in Quito, and he shared it with the others. From that moment on, the search was no longer just about looting towns. It was about finding the source. The broader context of this obsession is vital to understand. Spain was a nation transformed by the wealth of the Incas and Aztecs. The discovery of the silver mines at Potosí had created an economy where anything seemed possible. Spanish soldiers had seen rooms full of gold and silver, had witnessed the melting down of artifacts that represented centuries of artistic achievement, had watched as entire civilizations were reduced to numbers in a ledger book. To the conquistador, South America was not a continent. It was a treasure chest that had only been partially opened. They were men of a medieval mindset, raised on tales of chivalry and lost Christian kingdoms like that of Prester John in Ethiopia or the 7 cities of Cibola in the north. To them, a city of gold was not an impossibility. It was a logical expectation. After all, if the Aztecs had built Tenochtitlan and the Incas had built Machu Picchu, why shouldn't there be an even more magnificent city hidden somewhere in the vastness of the Amazon? But the search for El Dorado was also a search for social mobility. Most of these men were hidalgos, lower nobility with titles but no land or money. In the rigid hierarchy of Spain, they were nothing. But in the New World, with enough gold, they could be kings. This desperation created a psychological state where the most absurd rumors were treated as gospel truth. They ignored the reality of the terrain, the hostility of the climate, and the humanity of the people they encountered, all in service to a shimmering dream that was already beginning to vanish into the mist. As the years passed, the legend began to migrate. It became a geographical ghost, always just beyond the next mountain range, always in the territory of the next tribe. The search would take explorers into the most remote and dangerous regions of South America, places where the very act of survival required skills that no European possessed. They would follow rivers that led nowhere, climb mountains that pierced the clouds, and hack through jungles so dense that noon felt like midnight. The morning mist still clings to the canopy as we descend from the high plateau of the Muisca into the sprawling emerald maze that is the Amazon basin. Here, the air becomes thick as soup, laden with moisture and the rich, dark scent of decomposing vegetation. This is a world where the trees grow so densely that noon feels like twilight, where the sound of your own breathing is drowned out by the constant symphony of insects, birds, and monkeys you will never see. This is where the legend of El Dorado would transform from a local ritual into an international obsession, drawing men from across the known world into what the Spanish would come to call El Infierno Verde, the Green Hell. By the 1540s, the whisper had evolved. No longer content with the modest findings at Lake Guatavita, the Spanish had convinced themselves that the real treasure lay deeper in the continent, in a city called Manoa that supposedly sat on the shores of a vast inland lake called Perim. The indigenous people, whether through misunderstanding, deliberate misdirection, or genuine belief in distant wealthy kingdoms, consistently pointed the Europeans eastward into the trackless jungle. What followed was a series of expeditions that would test the absolute limits of human endurance and reveal the extent to which greed could drive men to madness. The first great Amazon expedition was launched not in search of gold, but in pursuit of something almost as valuable to the European palate: cinnamon. In 1541, Gonzalo Pizarro, the younger brother of Francisco Pizarro, the conqueror of the Incas, organized what he called the Journey to the Land of Cinnamon. The expedition began in Quito, high in the Ecuadorian Andes, with 220 Spanish soldiers, 4,000 indigenous carriers, a herd of llamas, a pack of war dogs, and enough supplies to last several months. What they had not accounted for was the sheer scale of the Amazon basin, an area larger than the continental United States, much of it unmapped and virtually impenetrable. Picture Gonzalo Pizarro himself, a man in his early 30s with the lean, hard look of a professional soldier. He had grown up hearing tales of his brother's incredible wealth, of rooms filled with gold and silver that had made the Pizarro name legendary throughout Spain. But Gonzalo was the younger brother, always in Francisco's shadow, and this expedition was his chance to carve out his own empire. He wore the finest steel armor money could buy, his helmet adorned with colorful plumes that would soon be rotted away by the jungle humidity. His sword had been forged in Toledo, its blade inscribed with prayers for victory. Within weeks, both the armor and the prayers would prove useless against an enemy that could not be fought, the jungle itself. The descent from the Andes into the Amazon basin is like traveling from one planet to another. At 11,000 feet, the air is crisp and thin, the sky a brilliant blue that seems close enough to touch. But as the expedition descended, following ancient trading paths that had been used by indigenous peoples for centuries, the landscape began to transform. The mountain pines gave way to cloud forests shrouded in perpetual mist. The clear mountain streams became muddy, slow-moving rivers the color of chocolate. The temperature rose, and with it came an oppressive humidity that turned every piece of metal into a furnace, and every scrap of fabric into a breeding ground for mold and parasites. The indigenous carriers began deserting within the first month. They were not slaves, technically speaking, but they had been recruited through a system of forced labor that made their participation anything but voluntary. As they melted away into the forest during the night watches, Pizarro found himself with an increasingly unwieldy baggage train and a rapidly diminishing knowledge of local geography. The carriers had been his guides as much as his laborers. Without them, the expedition was essentially traveling blind into a landscape that defied European comprehension. Francisco Orellana, Pizarro's cousin and most trusted lieutenant, was a man cut from different cloth. Where Pizarro was impulsive and aristocratic, Orellana was methodical and practical. He had lost an eye in a previous campaign, giving him a piratical appearance that belied his careful nature. When the expedition had been traveling for 6 months and was running desperately low on supplies, Orellana volunteered to take a small party down the Rio Napo in search of food and provisions. He promised to return within 12 days. He would not be seen again for nearly 2 years, and when he finally reached the Atlantic Ocean, he would carry with him tales that would reshape European understanding of the South American interior. Orellana's journey down what would later be called the Amazon River was one of the great accidental explorations in human history. What had started as a supply run became a 4,000-mile odyssey through completely unknown territory. Traveling in brigantines, small, shallow draft boats that could be portaged around rapids, Orellana and his 50 companions became the first Europeans to navigate the entire length of the world's largest river system. The river revealed itself slowly, like a vast green serpent uncoiling through the heart of the continent. At first, it was narrow enough that a man with a strong arm could throw a stone from bank to bank. But as they traveled north and east, following the current, the river grew wider and deeper, fed by hundreds of tributaries that drained an area larger than Europe. The water changed color as it flowed, sometimes clear as crystal, sometimes red as blood from iron-rich sediments, sometimes black as night from tannins leached from rotting vegetation. But it was Orellana's account of what he saw along the riverbanks that would fuel the El Dorado legend for centuries to come. He described vast cities with wide plazas and multi-story buildings, their walls decorated with precious metals and colorful ceramics. He wrote of encountering tribes of warrior women who fought with bows and arrows from the backs of canoes, women so fierce and skilled that his men dubbed them Amazons, after the legendary female warriors of Greek mythology. Most tantalizing of all, he reported hearing constant rumors of an incredibly wealthy kingdom somewhere in the interior, ruled by a king who possessed so much gold that he adorned his body with it daily. The indigenous societies that Orellana encountered were unlike anything in European experience. These were not the primitive hunter-gatherer societies that European prejudice expected to find in the jungle, but highly developed civilizations with their own forms of writing, astronomy, and metallurgy. They had learned to work within the ecosystem rather than against it, creating what we might now call sustainable cities that could support large populations while maintaining the appearance of pristine wilderness. The key to understanding these lost Amazonian civilizations lies in appreciating the delicate balance they maintained with their environment. Unlike European agriculture, which sought to dominate and reshape the landscape, Amazonian peoples had learned to work within the ecosystem, creating what anthropologists now call forest gardens. Areas where useful plants were concentrated and encouraged without completely clearing the native vegetation. They had developed techniques for creating incredibly fertile artificial soils called terra preta, black earth so rich that they are still among the most productive agricultural soils in the world 5 centuries after their creation. These societies had also mastered the art of river management, using the annual flood cycles to their advantage. During the dry season, they lived in permanent settlements on high ground, but when the rains came and the rivers swelled, they moved to floating villages that could rise and fall with the water level. Their entire calendar was built around the rhythm of the floods, with different seasons devoted to fishing, planting, harvesting, and ceremony. But the arrival of Europeans brought with it diseases for which the indigenous populations had no immunity. Smallpox, measles, typhoid, and influenza raced through the river communities faster than the explorers themselves, often reaching areas months or years before any Europeans set foot there. The demographic catastrophe that followed was unprecedented in human history. Entire civilizations simply vanished, leaving behind only scattered ruins and confused oral traditions. By the time later expeditions followed Orellana's route, they found only scattered survivors and empty settlements being reclaimed by the jungle. The absence of the great cities that Orellana had described led many Europeans to conclude that he had been lying or delusional, but modern research suggests that he was witnessing the last days of societies that had already been devastated by epidemic disease. Meanwhile, back in the jungle, Gonzalo Pizarro was facing his own disaster. Abandoned by Orellana and with his supply situation becoming increasingly desperate, he attempted to continue the search for the land of cinnamon with his remaining men. What followed was 18 months of unimaginable hardship. The Spanish, weighted down with armor that was useless in jungle warfare, found themselves constantly ambushed by indigenous groups protecting their territory. Their horses died from disease and exhaustion. Their firearms became unreliable in the constant humidity. Their food supplies rotted or were consumed by insects and monkeys. Pizarro's journal, fragments of which survived his eventual return to Quito, provides a harrowing account of men reduced to eating their leather belts, their sword sheaths, and even the leather straps of their armor. They attempted to hunt, but the jungle animals were either too quick or too dangerous to be practical prey. They tried to fish, but the rivers contained piranhas, electric eels, and caimans. Several men were killed by poisoned arrows fired by indigenous warriors they never saw. Others simply disappeared during night watches, claimed by jaguars or anacondas. The expedition became a walking nightmare of disease, starvation, and psychological breakdown. Men went mad from the isolation and the constant fear. They began to see cities of gold in every clearing, hear the sound of church bells in the screaming of howler monkeys. Some wandered off into the jungle and were never seen again. Others simply lay down beside the trail and refused to get up, preferring death to another day of marching through the green hill. By 1542, when Pizarro finally limped back into Quito with fewer than 80 survivors, the expedition had become a cautionary tale whispered in taverns throughout the Spanish colonies. But instead of discouraging further attempts, the failure only seemed to confirm that something valuable was being protected in the jungle depths. If the indigenous peoples were willing to fight so fiercely to keep Europeans out, the reasoning went, they must be protecting something worth having. The legend received a significant boost in 1595 when Sir Walter Raleigh, the English courtier, explorer, and poet, published an account of his own search for El Dorado titled, The Discovery of the Large, Rich, and Beautiful Empire of Guyana. Raleigh was a man of the English Renaissance, equally comfortable composing sonnets about lost love and leading military expeditions against Spanish treasure fleets. His interest in El Dorado was partly practical. England was locked in a bitter struggle with Spain for control of the New World, and any territory that could be claimed would strengthen England's position, but it was also deeply personal. Raleigh had fallen from favor with Queen Elizabeth I after secretly marrying one of her ladies-in-waiting, Elizabeth Throckmorton. The Queen, who demanded absolute loyalty from her courtiers and viewed their romantic entanglements as personal betrayals, had imprisoned both Raleigh and his wife in the Tower of London. Though they were eventually released, Raleigh found himself effectively banished from court. His career as a courtier ended by a single moment of passion. His search for El Dorado was, in part, an attempt to restore his reputation by presenting his queen with a prize that would dwarf all of Spain's American conquests. Raleigh had spent months in London poring over Spanish accounts of the various expeditions, interviewing Spanish prisoners of war, and collecting indigenous artifacts that seemed to confirm the existence of vast wealth somewhere in the Guyana highlands. He had also consulted with English merchants who had traded along the South American coast, gathering intelligence about river systems, indigenous politics, and Spanish defensive positions. Raleigh's 1595 expedition into the Orinoco River system was better planned and equipped than most previous attempts. He had studied the mistakes of earlier explorers and traveled light, using shallow draft boats that could navigate the complex river system of what is now Venezuela. His men were carefully selected volunteers rather than unwilling conscripts, and he had taken the time to learn basic phrases in several indigenous languages. More importantly, Raleigh approached the indigenous peoples he encountered with a level of respect that was unusual for his time. Rather than demanding submission and tribute, he presented himself as a potential ally against Spanish aggression. He distributed gifts rather than seizing supplies by force. He listened to indigenous stories and traditions rather than dismissing them as primitive superstitions. This approach earned him a level of cooperation that had been denied to more aggressive explorers. The result was that Raleigh obtained more detailed and consistent information about the El Dorado legend than any previous European. Multiple indigenous informants described a great lake in the interior mountains where a powerful chief lived in a city called Manoa. This city was said to be so rich that common household items were made of gold, and the buildings themselves were covered in sheets of the precious metal. The chief of this city was described as performing daily rituals involving gold dust, clearly a variant of the original Muisca ceremony that had started the entire legend. But Raleigh's expedition also revealed the first clear evidence that the legend might be more complex than previously understood. Some indigenous informants spoke not of a single golden city, but of an entire golden kingdom with multiple cities and a complex political structure. Others suggested that the Golden King was not a permanent ruler but a title that passed from person to person in elaborate ceremonies. Most intriguingly, some accounts suggested that the Golden City was not stationary but moved seasonally, following patterns of agriculture and trade that were incomprehensible to European observers. The Guyana highlands that Raleigh explored were unlike any landscape that Europeans had previously encountered in South America. Instead of the flat, tree-covered basins of the Amazon, this was a land of towering mesas and deep valleys, where waterfalls dropped from incredible heights and strange, twisted rock formations created a landscape that seemed more like another planet than another continent. The indigenous peoples of this region had adapted to the unique environment, building their settlements on the tops of the mesas and using rope bridges to cross the yawning chasms between them. Raleigh never found Manoa, despite penetrating farther into the interior than any previous English expedition. But his account of the search captivated the European imagination in a way that the Spanish reports had not. Where the Spanish accounts were dry military reports focused on practical details, Raleigh wrote with the sensibility of a poet and the political awareness of a courtier. His description of the Guyana highlands as a land of crystal mountains and golden rivers became the template for European fantasies about the South American interior for the next 2 centuries. More crucially, Raleigh's account included detailed ethnographic observations that modern scholars recognize as valuable anthropological data. He described complex trade networks that connected the highlands with the coast, sophisticated agricultural techniques adapted to tropical conditions, and political structures that combined elements of democracy and monarchy in ways that challenged European assumptions about indigenous government. Raleigh wrote of encountering indigenous chiefs who ruled not through force but through consensus, who maintained their authority by demonstrating their ability to provide for their people rather than by accumulating wealth for themselves. He described elaborate ceremonies that seemed to serve both religious and political functions, binding communities together through shared ritual and celebration. Most remarkably, He reported that many of the indigenous leaders he met could read and write in systems of notation that were completely unfamiliar to European observers. The failure of Raleigh's expedition to locate the Golden City led to a subtle but important shift in how the legend was understood. Earlier explorers had assumed that El Dorado was simply hidden and that success was a matter of finding the right route and bringing adequate supplies. But Raleigh's careful and systematic search had covered most of the areas where Manoa was supposed to exist. The fact that he had found no trace of a golden city, despite his respectful approach and detailed preparation, suggested that the legend might be more symbolic than literal. This shift coincided with changes in European attitudes toward the New World more generally. The age of the conquistador was ending, replaced by a more systematic approach to colonization that emphasized trade and administration over military conquest. The Spanish colonial government was becoming increasingly skeptical of expensive expeditions based on indigenous stories, particularly given the consistent failure of such expeditions to produce results proportional to their cost. But the legend refused to die. Instead, it began to migrate again, this time south toward the Brazilian Amazon and the unexplored territories beyond the reach of Spanish colonial administration. Portuguese expeditions pushing west from the Atlantic coast began to hear similar stories of wealthy kingdoms in the interior, and the legend of El Dorado began to merge with other myths about lost cities and hidden treasures. The 17th and 18th centuries saw a gradual transformation in the nature of the search for El Dorado. The crude military expeditions of the conquest period gave way to more sophisticated scientific explorations led by men like Charles-Marie de la Condamine, Alexander von Humboldt, and Alfred Russel Wallace. These explorers were less interested in finding gold than in mapping the geography, cataloging the flora and fauna, and understanding the cultures of the South American interior. But even these scientific expeditions continued to be haunted by the ghost of the Golden City. Indigenous guides would still point toward distant mountains and speak of wealthy kingdoms beyond the horizon. Traders would produce artifacts that seemed to confirm the existence of sophisticated metallurgical traditions somewhere in the unexplored interior. And occasionally, a returning expedition would bring back stories that seemed too detailed and consistent to be dismissed as fantasy. One of the most intriguing of these later accounts came from a Portuguese explorer named Francisco Raposo, who claimed in 1754 to have discovered the ruins of an ancient city somewhere in the Brazilian interior. Raposo's account was unlike any previous description of El Dorado discoveries. Instead of describing a living city filled with gold, he wrote about finding massive stone ruins covered by jungle vegetation, with inscriptions in an unknown script carved into walls that rose like cliffs from the forest floor. According to Raposo's detailed report, which he submitted to the Portuguese colonial authorities in Rio de Janeiro, his expedition had been following rumors of emerald mines when they became lost in the trackless interior of what is now the state of Minas Gerais. After weeks of wandering through increasingly rugged terrain, they climbed a ridge and found themselves looking down into a hidden valley where the remains of a vast city lay scattered among the trees. The expedition descended into the valley and spent several days exploring what Raposo described as the most magnificent ruins he had ever seen. There were pyramids and temples, broad plazas paved with fitted stone blocks, and residential areas that suggested a population that had once numbered in the tens of thousands. Most remarkably, many of the buildings were decorated with what appeared to be precious metals. though whether these were gold, silver, or some other material, Raposo could not determine. But what made Raposo's account particularly compelling was his description of the inscriptions. Unlike the pictographic writing systems that the Spanish had encountered among the Aztecs and other Mesoamerican peoples, these inscriptions appeared to be alphabetic, with individual letters arranged in words and sentences. Raposo copied several examples of the script, and when these were examined by scholars in Lisbon, they were found to resemble no known writing system, either ancient or modern. The Portuguese government organized several expeditions to relocate Raposo's lost city, but none succeeded. The interior of Brazil was a maze of nearly identical valleys and ridges, covered by dense forest that made navigation extremely difficult. Raposo himself attempted to retrace his steps but was unable to find the valley again. Over time, his account came to be viewed with skepticism, dismissed as either a fabrication or the result of hallucination brought on by the hardships of jungle travel. Yet Raposo's description contained details that were remarkably consistent with genuine archaeological discoveries that would not be made until the 20th century. His account of fitted stone construction, sophisticated urban planning, and alphabetic writing all proved to be accurate descriptions of ancient South American civilizations that were unknown to European scholars in the 18th century. Whether Raposo actually discovered a lost city or simply possessed an unusually vivid imagination, his account represents a crucial transition in the evolution of the El Dorado legend. By the late 18th century, the search for El Dorado had become as much a literary pursuit as a geographical one. Voltaire used the legend as the setting for his satirical novel Candide, creating a fictional El Dorado that served as a perfect society where gold was so common that children played with emeralds in the streets. Voltaire's El Dorado was not a place of wealth accumulation but of wisdom and contentment, where the inhabitants lived in harmony with nature and had no need for armies or prisons. This literary transformation of the legend reflected broader changes in European thinking about civilization and progress. The Enlightenment had brought with it a skeptical attitude toward tales of miraculous discoveries and fantastic wealth. But it had also created a new interest in the possibility of perfect societies, utopian communities where human nature could be perfected through reason and education. El Dorado became a canvas for these utopian dreams, a place where European philosophers could imagine alternatives to the corruption and inequality of their own societies. The Romantic movement of the 19th century brought yet another transformation to the legend. Poets like Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Lord Byron used El Dorado as a symbol of the unattainable dream, the impossible quest that reveals more about the seeker than about the object of the search. In their hands, the legend became a meditation on desire itself, a story about the way human beings create meaning through the pursuit of goals that may not actually exist. Edgar Allan Poe's poem El Dorado captured this romantic interpretation perfectly. Gaily bedight, a gallant knight, in sunshine and in shadow, had journeyed long, singing a song, in search of El Dorado. But he grew old, this knight so bold, and o'er his heart a shadow fell as he found no spot of ground that looked like El Dorado. Poe's knight dies without finding his golden city, but his death is portrayed not as a failure but as a noble pursuit, a quest that gives meaning to life even in its impossibility. Meanwhile, the actual search for El Dorado was taking on new forms. The 19th century saw the rise of scientific archaeology and anthropology, disciplines that approached the legend with tools and methods unknown to earlier explorers. Heinrich Schliemann's discovery of Troy using Homer's Iliad as a guide inspired a new generation of archaeologists to take ancient legends seriously as potential sources of historical information. In South America, this scientific approach began to yield remarkable results. German archaeologist Max Euhl conducted systematic excavations in Peru and Bolivia that revealed the existence of sophisticated pre-Columbian civilizations that had been completely unknown to European scholarship. The discovery of cultures like the Chavin, Nazca, and Tiwanaku demonstrated that the Spanish conquistadors had encountered only the most recent layer of South American civilization, that there were entire histories buried beneath the ground they had walked on. But it was the work of British archaeologist Sir Aurel Stein and his contemporaries in other parts of the world that provided the most compelling evidence that legends like El Dorado might have factual foundations. Stein's discovery of lost cities in Central Asia, buried for centuries beneath shifting sands, proved that urban civilizations could indeed vanish so completely that their very existence became mythical. This realization led to renewed interest in the Brazilian interior, where the combination of dense jungle vegetation and rapid plant growth meant that even massive stone structures could disappear from view within a few decades. Expeditions began to use new technologies like aerial photography and ground-penetrating radar to search for hidden ruins beneath the forest canopy. The early 20th century brought the most systematic attempt yet to locate the historical foundation of the El Dorado legend. British explorer Percy Fawcett, a former military officer and experienced surveyor, became convinced that the Brazilian interior contained the remains of a sophisticated ancient civilization that he called Z. Fawcett based his theory on a combination of Portuguese colonial documents, indigenous oral traditions, and his own observations during previous expeditions to map the borders between Brazil and its neighbors. Fawcett was not a treasure hunter in the traditional sense. He was interested in gold only insofar as it might provide evidence of advanced metallurgical techniques. His real goal was to prove that South America had been home to civilizations that rivaled those of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia in their complexity and achievement. He believed that the discovery of such a civilization would force Europeans to reconsider their assumptions about the capabilities of indigenous American peoples. Fawcett's preparations for his final expedition were meticulous. He spent years studying Portuguese archives in Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, collecting maps and documents that dated back to the earliest colonial period. He interviewed indigenous elders who claimed to possess knowledge of ancient cities passed down through oral tradition. He assembled a team of carefully selected companions, including his eldest son Jack and Jack's friend Raleigh Rimmel. In 1925, Fawcett's expedition disappeared into the Mato Grosso region of Brazil and was never seen again. The mystery of their fate captured international attention and inspired dozens of rescue expeditions, most of which also disappeared or returned with conflicting stories about what had happened to the missing explorers. Some claimed that Fawcett had been killed by hostile indigenous groups. Others suggested that he had been captured and was being held prisoner. Still others believed that he had actually found his lost city and chose to remain there rather than return to civilization. The disappearance of Percy Fawcett marked the end of the classical age of El Dorado exploration. The 20th century brought new technologies and new approaches to the search for lost civilizations, But it also brought new skepticism about the romantic myths that had driven earlier explorers. The rise of scientific archaeology meant that spectacular discoveries were now measured against rigorous standards of evidence rather than judged by their ability to capture the popular imagination. Yet, even as the scientific approach began to dominate the field, the discoveries it produced were in many ways more remarkable than anything the treasure hunters had imagined. Aerial surveys of the Amazon basin began to reveal geometric earthworks covering vast areas, evidence of sophisticated engineering projects that had reshaped entire landscapes. Ground-penetrating radar detected the foundations of large settlements buried beneath what appeared to be virgin forest. Most remarkably, the development of satellite imagery in the late 20th century allowed archaeologists to see patterns in the landscape that were invisible from ground level. Long, straight lines that cut across hundreds of miles of jungle, circular and rectangular clearings arranged in complex geometric patterns, and raised fields that indicated intensive agriculture on a scale that could have supported populations in the millions. The reality that emerged from these discoveries was more complex and more fascinating than any treasure hunter's fantasy. The Amazon basin had indeed been home to sophisticated civilizations, but these were not the gold-obsessed kingdoms that the Spanish had imagined. Instead, they were societies that had achieved a remarkable balance between human needs and environmental sustainability, creating urban centers that worked with the forest ecosystem rather than against it. The cities that satellite archaeology revealed were not built of stone and metal but of earth and wood, materials that had long since returned to the forest from which they came. The wealth of these civilizations was not measured in accumulations of precious metals, but in their sophisticated understanding of ecology, their ability to create abundance without destruction. But perhaps the most important discovery was that many of these Amazonian civilizations had survived long enough to encounter European explorers. The accounts of Orellana and other early explorers, which had been dismissed as fantasies, began to be reevaluated as accurate descriptions of societies that were already in decline due to epidemic disease. This realization cast the entire El Dorado legend in a new light. The golden city that the Spanish sought had never existed in the form they imagined, but the reality was in some ways even more remarkable. They had been searching for a civilization that valued gold above all else, but they had encountered civilizations that had achieved something far more precious: the ability to live in harmony with their environment while supporting populations that rivaled those of contemporary Europe. The modern search for El Dorado has become less about finding a specific city and more about understanding a complex network of interconnected societies that once flourished throughout the South American interior. Using tools like LiDAR, light detection and ranging technology, archaeologists can now peer through the forest canopy to map the remains of ancient settlements with unprecedented precision. These investigations have revealed that the Amazon basin was home to what archaeologists now call the Amazonian formative, a series of related cultures that developed sophisticated techniques for forest management, water control, and sustainable agriculture. These societies created artificial islands in flood-prone areas, built raised fields that could produce multiple crops per year, and developed forms of urban planning that integrated human settlements seamlessly into the natural landscape. The terra preta soils that these societies created are still among the most fertile in the world, supporting agricultural productivity that far exceeds what modern techniques can achieve in similar environments. The earthworks they built continue to function as flood control systems, protecting modern communities from the extremes of the annual flood cycle. But perhaps most remarkably, many of the techniques that these ancient societies developed are now being studied as potential solutions to modern environmental challenges. Their methods of sustainable forestry, water management, and soil creation offer insights that could help address contemporary problems like deforestation, climate change, and food security. The El Dorado legend has also taken on new meanings in the context of modern environmental awareness. The golden city that the conquistadors sought has become a symbol of the destructive pursuit of wealth at any cost, while the real Amazonian civilizations they encountered represent an alternative model of human development based on sustainability and ecological wisdom. Indigenous communities throughout the Amazon basin continue to maintain traditional knowledge systems that descend directly from these ancient civilizations. Their understanding of forest ecology, medicinal plants, and sustainable resource management represents a living connection to the sophisticated societies that once flourished throughout the region. Modern anthropologists and ethnobotanists work with indigenous communities to document this traditional knowledge before it is lost to the pressures of modernization. In many cases, they have found that indigenous practices that were dismissed by earlier generations of scientists are based on sophisticated understanding of complex ecological relationships. The search for El Dorado has thus evolved from a quest for material wealth to a search for wisdom about how human societies can thrive without destroying the environments that sustain them. The golden city that the Spanish never found has become a symbol of human possibility, not in terms of accumulating treasure, but in terms of creating sustainable abundance. Yet the romantic appeal of the original legend continues to exert its influence. Modern adventure tourism in South America often includes visits to sites associated with El Dorado expeditions, and popular culture continues to produce films, novels, and video games that draw on the imagery of lost cities and hidden treasures. This persistent fascination with El Dorado reflects something deep in human psychology, a need to believe that somewhere beyond the horizon lies something better than what we currently know. The legend serves as a kind of psychological compass, always pointing toward the unknown and the possible. But the real lesson of the El Dorado legend may be that the treasures we seek are often different from the treasures we find. The Spanish conquistadors sought gold and found genocide. The indigenous peoples they encountered possessed wealth beyond European comprehension, sophisticated knowledge of ecology, medicine, and sustainable living. But it was wealth that their conquerors literally could not see. The modern scientific search for the archaeological foundations of the El Dorado legend has revealed treasures that the original treasure hunters could never have imagined. Insights into human adaptability, environmental management, and the possibility of creating abundance without destruction. These discoveries suggest that the real El Dorado was never a city of gold, but a way of living that created wealth without creating scarcity. As satellite imagery continues to reveal new archaeological sites throughout the Amazon basin, and as climate change makes the lessons of sustainable development increasingly urgent, the El Dorado legend takes on new relevance. The quest for the Golden City continues, but it has been transformed into a search for golden principles. Ways of organizing human society that create prosperity without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The whisper that began at Lake Guatavita has become a global conversation about what human civilization could become. The Gilded One who dove into the sacred lake 5 centuries ago has become a symbol of transformation, of the possibility that humans can choose to live in harmony with the natural world rather than in competition with it. In the end, perhaps the most remarkable thing about the El Dorado legend is its ability to evolve and adapt to changing circumstances while retaining its essential power to inspire. From a Muisca ceremony to a Spanish obsession to a literary symbol to a scientific quest to an environmental metaphor, the legend has served as a mirror for human hopes and fears across 5 centuries of dramatic change. The city of gold that Francisco Pizarro's men imagined never existed, but the civilization that inspired the legend created something far more valuable. A demonstration that humans can build complex, prosperous societies without exhausting the resources that sustain them. The real treasure of El Dorado lies not in some hidden cache of precious metals, but in the knowledge that such societies are possible. Today, as we face environmental challenges that dwarf anything confronted by previous generations, the Amazon basin has become a laboratory for sustainable development. Indigenous communities, environmental scientists, and policymakers work together to develop new approaches to conservation and development that draw on both traditional knowledge and modern technology. The forests that once hid the Golden City from Spanish explorers now hide carbon that could help stabilize the global climate. The rivers that once carried treasure hunters to their doom now carry researchers studying biodiversity that could provide new medicines and new insights into ecological relationships. The indigenous peoples who once pointed Spanish explorers toward distant kingdoms now point modern researchers toward sustainable practices that could help ensure human survival. As our story draws to its close, we find ourselves back where we began, at the edge of Lake Guatavita, where a Muisca chief once covered himself in gold dust and dove into the sacred waters. But now we understand that the real offering was not the gold he washed from his body, but the principle he embodied. The recognition that humans are part of a larger whole, that our prosperity depends on the health of the systems that sustain us, and that true wealth lies not in what we can extract from the world, but in what we can contribute to it. The whisper of El Dorado continues to echo through the centuries, but its message has been transformed. It no longer promises easy wealth or magical kingdoms, but something far more precious. The possibility that humans can learn to live as caretakers rather than conquerors, as participants in the web of life rather than its masters. The Golden City was never found because it was never lost. It exists wherever humans choose to build societies based on wisdom rather than greed, on sustainability rather than exploitation, on cooperation rather than competition. The real El Dorado is not a place on a map, but a way of being in the world. A possibility that remains as bright and as elusive as the golden reflection of the sun on the waters of a sacred lake. If you've enjoyed this journey through the mists of time and legend, through the heart of human ambition and the depths of the Amazon, please consider liking this video and subscribing to History Bedtime Stories. Your support allows us to continue exploring the forgotten corners of our past, where ancient wisdom whispers across the centuries, offering guidance for the challenges we face today. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers, and may your own quests lead you not to cities of gold, but to treasures beyond price.